There's a number of reasons why the heart is the most powerful organ of perception and communication. It's one of the major endocrine glands in the body. It has its own complex nervous system with many direct and uninterrupted connections with the brain, and it produces a number of its own neurotransmitters, dopamine being a good example. Now, those are things I'll probably cover in more detail in a separate video, but in this video I wanted to look at the very powerful electromagnetic field that's generated by the heart, and it's really what makes the heart the most powerful biological oscillator in the whole body, and it's actually many thousands of times more powerful than the electromagnetic field that's produced by the brain. So this all starts in the really early stages of development of the embryo, and when the heart begins to form, there's certain types of cell in the heart called pacemaker cells, and they're actually the cells that do all the beating. And when the first pacemaker cell reaches a particular stage of development, which is very, very early on, it begins to spontaneously beat, and it does this without any outside influence. There's no external stimulus that is making it beat. It just spontaneously decides to start beating, which really, I think, suggests a very high level of intelligence and really a conscious self-awareness. Now, once that first pacemaker cell begins to beat, many other pacemaker cells begin to reach that stage of development as well, but they all begin to entrain themselves to that first cell that began to beat, so they all beat in rhythm and in harmony with that first cell, beating as one organism. Now, there's been some laboratory tests done on these pacemaker cells where one of them has been kept in isolation, and what is observed over time is that its rhythm and its beating pattern become quite erratic and quite chaotic, and it really begins to lose any coherence and begins to get really quite sick, and then after a short period it will die. Now, in these experiments, they've also placed, when one of these cells is in isolation and it's beginning to struggle, they place another one within, they're not touching, they don't even really need to be next to each other or even really near each other, but they need to be, within the same room, let's say. And the second pacemaker cell that gets introduced is obviously a much healthier cell. It still has a lot of its integrity, and what's been observed is that the original cell that was in isolation, that's actually struggling and doing very badly, begins to entrain itself to the rhythm of the healthy pacemaker cell that's been placed within, a certain amount of proximity to it. And this really is the electromagnetic field of the heart that we're talking about here, generated by each individual pacemaker cell, because it's the merging of these electromagnetic fields that allows these cells to communicate with each other and to outreach each other and to help each other. And this is what allows this severely sick and depleted pacemaker cell to actually regain all of its vitality, all of its health and integrity, and actually begin to beat in unison with this other healthy cell that's been placed not even next to it, at the other side of the room. So this is a really, really interesting observation about the electromagnetic field generated by the heart. So there's millions of these beating, oscillating cells in the heart that are all working together to generate this extensive electromagnetic field that's really regulating all biological processes in the body, but it's also interacting constantly with every other electromagnetic field outside of the body. So the field is really never the same from one moment to the next, or from one heartbeat to the next. It's constantly changing its expression based upon the messages that it's receiving from both inside and outside of the body. Now, when this field is measured around the human body, it's actually much larger than the physical body, and it just envelops the whole thing and all the surrounding area in a kind of fractal geometry called a torus, or a double torus in this case, which is really like a perpetually moving and changing flow of energy that is expressing itself outwards while simultaneously flowing back into itself as a kind of feedback mechanism. And the heart is at the epicenter of this torus, just like in this picture that you're looking at now. So the heart is really receiving information and it's transmitting responses back into the surrounding environment in a kind of dynamic two-way communication. So in this way, we're really not at all separate from our surroundings, but we're actually very intimately connected in a really complex and extremely meaningful dialogue. Now, magnetic field meters can measure this field over 10 feet from the skin or from the surface of the body, but in reality, this field actually extends into space indefinitely. The field just becomes much more subtle and harder to measure the further away it gets from the body. So all living things are producing this kind of fractal field. Everything, like rocks, plants, animals, the earth itself, everything is producing this kind of field, and it's interacting with our own electromagnetic field, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. And in fact, everything that we know of is producing this kind of field, this double torus structure, from the infinitely big to the infinitely small. It could be the structure of an atom, or it could be the structure of a planet, or a solar system, or a galaxy. This is a fundamental pattern of the structure of life. So just like the way that the beating cells in the heart entrain to one another and they synchronize their collective beating pattern, the electromagnetic field of the heart and every other field that it encounters in the world become very much aware of each other, and through a kind of dynamic form of communication, they can entrain to one another and synchronize. Now, there is a vast amount of different frequencies that we can encounter, and all of these are experienced by the heart as feelings or different types of emotion. So, this kind of explains why we can just feel really good by being around someone who is in a really good mood or has a really good vibe about them. Or, we can instantly become really negative. We can become very angry and frustrated and even depressed just by being around someone who's expressing any of these emotions. So, the extent and the range of changes that can occur in the heart and, in the whole human body in response to this kind of interaction, it can get very, very subtle as well. So, our hearts are always interacting and communicating in this way, like every single moment. But they're also interacting this same way with just everything in the environment, with plants, with animals, rocks, water, the earth, pressure waves, the weather. There doesn't really at all need to be an actual physical beating heart for this type of communication to take place. So this sort of meaningful interaction between our hearts and the world outside is taking place constantly. I mean, this is actually the first kind of experience that we ever have. When we're still in the womb, our little hearts entrain to our mother's heart, and there's a very intimate form of communication taking place throughout that entire gestation period, and a lot of time after that as well. So the first human experiences we have with communication and actually receiving information, they're all perceptions of the heart. But unfortunately, this is not something that has any emphasis placed upon it as we get older in the kind of cultures that most of us live in through our childhood upbringing and the schooling system that we're a part of, and just the broad system that we're all living in society. It really doesn't at all cultivate this kind of awareness. It really trains us to develop specifically the cognitive capacity of our brains in isolation, and really allow this intelligence and this capacity of the heart to perceive and understand things is just allowed to decay. Perceiving and communicating with the heart is absolutely an essential component of being human. And from allowing this ability within ourselves to become severely undernourished, we've actually allowed the linear function of the brain to dominate, and our non-linear heart has tried to entrain itself to the linear function of the brain, which, you know, we can't expect to have a healthy heart function on any level if we're forcing it to behave in a way that it's not meant to be behaving in. Now, because the heart is the most powerful biological oscillator in the body, all other oscillatory organs of perception, like the brain and like the intestines, should really be entraining their function to that rhythm of the heart, and they should be synchronizing with the heart and letting the heart lead and the heart guide. And when we do that, we do witness a much healthier overall human organism that's in a state of homeodynamics rather than homeostasis. So you can easily see how this brain-centered way of perceiving the world has led to such a disconnected human experience, where a lot of what we deem as progress actually involves a lot of oppression and a lot of destruction, where largely the needs and the feelings of some, or most, are really ignored in favor of the greed and the apparent superiority of others. So, you know, the heart really is the only organ of perception that's actually capable of feeling any empathy and possessing any real moral fiber. And it's the heart that really connects us in a meaningful way to others and to our surroundings. So, you know, when we end up living in a world that is focusing primarily on the brain as a way of perception, then we end up in a world that's severely deficient in feeling and empathy and, you know, ethical principles, and we can live within societies that really don't connect with nature at all, and they don't feel the inherent intelligence and wisdom of nature. And, you know, these kind of societies just don't cultivate biodiversity as the highest form of wealth. So when we cultivate this cognitive capacity of the heart, we can actively begin entraining our electromagnetic field to those that we find around us in nature, and begin having this dynamic two-way communication, and really relearning and rediscovering our ability to connect with nature in this way. And, you know, through doing that, we can really realize that communicating with plants and trees and animals and all of these things, having intelligent communication with all of these beings, is not at all the domain of fairy tales alone. It's not at all something that you hear crazy people talking about. This is actually very normal. It's very possible we have access to this kind of ability in the moment. So this is actually how all of our ancestors became so knowledgeable and so wise about the earth, about nature, and about how to heal and nourish themselves, because they didn't have science a long, long time ago. There weren't microscopes. There wasn't this linear, reductionist way of analyzing and scrutinizing everything. The way in which our ancestors and indigenous peoples actually developed such a vast depth of wisdom was because they approached nature with an open heart and actually engaged in this kind of two-way interaction that we're talking about.